Chapter 9. Duncan let out a breath he hadn't been aware that he was holding, and looked at the sleeping forms of Ollie and Finn. He was more tired than he had known it was possible to be. He'd had a long day, keeping up with the physically draining exercises that the goblins demanded of them. He'd been given little food, and he had not slept yet. Then the experience of using the ring to free Charlie had taken a level of concentration that had taken him close to complete mental exhaustion, on top of the physical exhaustion. But, knowing that he had the power to free them from their magical prisons, he couldn't leave them to that fate any longer. He nodded, the movement making his neck ache. Then he squirmed slowly closer to Finn, close enough to reach out and touch Finn's ankle. Once more he felt around that magical wall, looking for any crack or blemish. There was no crack this time, but there was a point where it felt thinner, so that was where he worked. There was no clumsy smashing his mind flat against the wall this time. From the first, he shaped his will into a dense, sharp point, a dangerous pickaxe with which to attack. Again and again he raised his thoughts up, shaped them into an ever finer point and smashed it down, always aiming at the same spot. Duncan had no idea how long it was taking, but it did not feel like a fast process. He got into a rhythm, 5 blows, then stop and feel for progress. It was slow in coming, but eventually that thinner section began to feel like a crack in the magical wall that held Finn's consciousness captive. More and more hits and the crack grew. The magical barrier was beginning to crumble around that crack. Duncan felt he was close, that Finn would soon be able to think for himself again, when he was dragged up to the real world by Charlie shaking his arm and urgently whispering into his ear. Duncan! Something is happening. I don't know what. It doesn't seem normal. You have to hurry up. Free them. Duncan, can you hear me? There was fear and panic in Charlie's voice, but for them this was a world that had only fear and panic to offer. Duncan had to free them and find a way to get them all back to their own world, to their families. But he was so tired. He struggled to form words to answer Charlie. I'm close, he managed to croak. Just another minute. He didn't wait to hear Charlie's response, throwing his mind at Finn's prison once or twice more, feeling desperate. Then that gratifying feel of the magic shattering once more came in a burst. The backlash was like a slap in the face that made Duncan feel awake for a moment, although exhaustion made his thoughts slow, his mind groggy. It was still night, but there was now movement and noise all over the camp. Charlie was right, something was going on, something that didn't seem like it was a common occurrence in the camp. There were orders being shouted and teenage boys under the spells of goblins leapt to obey. Finn sat up, his eyes wide in astonishment, but he had no time to say or do anything as a goblin appeared and shouted an order at them.
Everyone, wake up and report to the west gate of the camp.
The voice of this goblin was shriller than the croaky voice of Pelkar, but it had the same result. The goblin didn't wait to check that his orders were being followed and moved on towards the next tent, confident that he would be obeyed without thought. Oliver, still firmly under the grip of Pelkar's magic, snapped his eyes open instantly and leapt to his feet. Charlie reacted quickly, throwing himself to catch Ollie's foot, even as Ollie attempted to spring into a run towards the west gate. Ollie fell to the floor, with Charlie still gripping his foot and calling to Duncan, Quick! You have to free him too! Duncan was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open, struggling to bring himself to move forward and attempt to place his hand on Ollie, to make contact with the ring. It was futile. Charlie had a poor grip on Ollie, who was the biggest of them all, and was being driven by magic, putting no effort into anything other than obeying the order to report to the west gate. Before Duncan could do anything useful, Ollie had shaken free of Charlie, and burst into a sprint into pre-dawn gloominess. Charlie stared after Ollie, open-mouthed, and Finn solemnly looked around at them. Even Finn, his mind freshly released from a mental prison, knew that they had just watched their friend sprint off to a life of magic-enforced slavery, war, and death. But, thought Duncan, we are free, and we will do what we can to save him, to save all of the slave soldiers. Against every wish of his exhausted mind and body, Duncan forced himself to his feet. Battling against dizziness, he extended his hands towards his 2 remaining friends and helped them to their feet. We've got a lot to do, he told them. They nodded, knowing that if they failed to take this chance at breaking free of the goblins, there would never be another. Helping to steady a still dazed Finn, he whispered to his 2 friends, We need to find some food and water and then sneak out of the camp. Charlie nodded vigorously, eager to be away from the goblins. Finn struggled to think for a moment before quietly saying, I think I know where they keep the food. One of my errands yesterday was to help get the gruel that they feed us. It's a bit like a hazy dream, but I think I can find it again. Duncan urged Finn to lead the way, while keeping an eye out for any goblins. The three boys, scared and desperate, made their way through the dark camp. Teenage boys and their goblin masters, carrying flaming torches, were rushing towards the west gate and whatever might be happening there. Finn led them across that path. They were noticeable because they took a different path from everyone else, so they hid in shadows and waited until no one was coming as they sneaked between rows of tents and small ramshackle wooden huts. A relieved look spread across Finn's face as he saw a shed-like structure, and he whispered to Duncan and Charlie, "That's it! That's where the food is kept. I don't think it's locked." Duncan imagined it wouldn't be locked, as it was unlikely that anyone had ever had the free will to think of stealing food before. It was quieter now, with less movement. Most of the camp had already reported to the gate. The three boys darted over to the food store, swung the door open and slipped inside. It was dark inside, and the boys had no light, but fearful of being recaptured, they needed to be quick. "Grab whatever food you can carry. Who knows when we'll next be able to get food?" So the three of them started searching in the gloomy shed, feeling for any food that felt familiar. "I found some sacks," Charlie whispered out excitedly, as he handed sacks to Duncan and Finn. The three of them then started stuffing their sacks full of whatever seemed like it might be edible. With as much food supplies as they could carry, they exited the food store and dashed into what looked like a less used hut nearby. When they entered that, they discovered racks of weapons. In their short time they had been put through a very basic lesson with spear and sword, barely learning more than how to hold the weapons. Thinking as fast as his exhausted mind would allow, Duncan spoke to his friends. "We should take a weapon each. We might need them." Duncan picked up a sword. Finn also picked up a sword, but after almost stabbing himself with it as he tried to slide it into a scabbard, he put it down and picked up a spear. Charlie, meanwhile, was checking the bows, testing a few. Then he seemed to settle on one and picked up a quiver of arrows that rested nearby, slinging it over his shoulder. "You ever used one of those?" Duncan asked his friend. "Actually, my dad's really into archery. He made me learn. I never liked it. It always seemed silly learning something that would never be useful. Now I wish I'd taken it more seriously," replied Charlie. Finn snorted at the madness of the situation, asking, "You mean you didn't foresee being kidnapped by goblins and having to survive in another world with nothing but a spear or a bow?" Duncan ignored the sarcasm. "Let's go. We have to try and get out of the camp," he said. "Hopefully, since everyone has gone to the west gate, we might be able to sneak out one of the other gates." Duncan barely saw their nods of agreement in the darkness, but they moved towards the door with him. They stepped out of the armory hut and moved through the camp towards the north gate, which was the nearest. They turned a corner and came face to face with a goblin flanked by 4 armed teenage human soldiers. All were bigger and older than Duncan, and looked like they knew how to use the swords they carried. Duncan knew they couldn't win any fight here, and he panicked, not knowing which direction to run. But the goblins and soldiers didn't look concerned. The goblin looked at their sacks and asked,
"You were sent to get supplies? Who by?" "I was sent to collect the supplies." "Oh, it doesn't matter. Quickly, you three. Come to the west gate with us."
And he pointed, ushering them. The goblin expected any human it came across to obey unconditionally, and Duncan knew that they had to obey to keep it secret that they were no longer under the control of Pelkar's magic. So he quickly headed the way the goblin pointed, shoving Finn and Charlie to make them go too. They were not practiced in pretending to be under magical control. The goblin and his daunting soldiers followed closely. "What am I doing?" Duncan kept asking himself. He needed to escape, but here he was being shepherded towards a massing army of goblins and their mindless soldiers, who would kill him the moment they realized he wasn't under their power. When they reached the west gate, it was well lit by burning torches, and Duncan could hear the sound of lots of people, but they weren't in the camp, so he headed on through, leading the party of his 2 friends and their escort. Outside the camp was a sea of grass. Massed on it were neat rows of teenage soldiers, with their goblin commanders giving orders. One row at a time, the soldiers were led through some sort of magical portal, a glowing green disc that floated just an inch above the ground. These soldiers were armed and looked ready for battle. The goblin trailing the 3 boys directed them to join a row of soldiers. So, not wanting to blow their cover, they did. When the goblin moved away, content that he had done his job, Duncan whispered to the unknown teenage boy in front of him, "What's going on?" The boy gave him a confused look, as if he wasn't used to being asked questions. But the goblins obviously hadn't forbidden talking, as he answered as soon as he was over that initial confusion. We're taking part in some sort of surprise attack? Apparently it's a new enemy. Fairies! Forces are being sent from camps all across King Umkar's lands. We're next. We really are next, Duncan realised, with no time to digest the new information that fairies also existed in this world. The rows started moving towards the portal. Duncan shot a nervous look back at Charlie and Finn, but could do nothing but shrug and begin to move with the row of soldiers. There were hundreds of soldiers and goblins on both sides of the portal, but perhaps a battle would present more opportunity for escape. Or I could get killed, he realised, but tried to keep that thought buried as he didn't really have many options right then. Following the boys before him, Duncan leapt through the green glowing portal into the unknown.